While that NPK triangle tightened its grip, lawmakers drew a line you don't see on the receipt. On one side, food, on the other, inputs. Cross that line with a bag of fertilizer and the rulebook changes. The tomato on your plate answers to food safety laws, traceability, contamination thresholds, recall procedures, nutrition labels. The nitrogen that grew it gets treated like an industrial chemical that never touches your lips, because technically it doesn't. It just moves through soil, into leaves, into you. Get this, regulators in most countries carved out an entire category for farm inputs. Fertilizers were placed with cement, solvents, and industrial gases, subject to product standards for purity and handling, but not the kind of scrutiny applied to bread or baby formula. The logic sounded tidy. You don't consume fertilizer, but call it an input and you've solved a legal problem, not a biological one. Molecules don't respect paperwork. They move. That's the loophole. Industrial input rules where food exposure logic belongs. Here, S where the loophole breathes. Labels on fertilizer bags list NPK ratios and sometimes a short ingredients line, but proprietary blends and coatings sit behind confidentiality. Manufacturers call it trade secret protection. Farmers call it a shrug. There isn't a mandate to disclose full life cycle data the way food producers disclose allergens or additives. You won't find a nitrogen footprint per pound of corn on the shelf. You won't find the origin mine for the phosphorus that ended up in your baguette. The packet at the field gate stands invisible at the grocery gate. Meanwhile, the cost of that invisibility lands in places that don't send invoices. Excess nitrogen leaches into groundwater. Local clinics track blue baby advisories after heavy rains. Downstream utilities install nitrate removal equipment and raise water bills. Nobody itemizes fertilizer runoff surcharge. Estuaries flip to seasonal dead zones. Fishermen shift docks or quit. The price of shrimp inches up, and a diner in Omaha wonders why the special changed. Externalities sound academic, until the well behind your house needs a reverse osmosis unit you can't afford. And the accounting trick goes further. When a chemical is classified as an industrial input, emissions and spills get tracked in environmental ledgers, not food safety systems. That means the surveillance net misses what matters to eaters. Upstream issues rarely trigger downstream recalls. A problem at a phosphate reactor might set off occupational hazard reports and fines. It won't pull cereal from shelves. In the produce aisle, a lettuce E. coli scare makes news. In a fertilizer plant, a contamination scare becomes a compliance note. Lobbyists worked hard to keep that line intact. Farm bills and subsidy programs frame fertilizer as essential infrastructure, bundling access and credit into the definition of modern agriculture. Procurement rules reward volume and uniformity, which favors synthetic inputs that meet spec and ship like clockwork. State houses hear about feeding the world. Committee rooms hear about regulatory certainty. Somewhere in that phrase, the right to know morphs into the right to sell. Microstory, a state legislator tour a gleaming granulation plant. Safety posters, hard hats, a tidy control room that looks like a spaceship command deck. The briefing packet says the product is safe when used as directed. He nods. Later, he drives past a sign warning about nitrate levels in a rural well field. Different agencies, different budgets. No single place to connect the dots unless you're a parent staring at a tap. There's a detail most shoppers don't realize. Food safety law is built around endpoints. It watches the finished product and the kitchen. But fertilizers change the starting line of the food system. If we inverted the logic, if we treated inputs with food-grade seriousness, blends would carry disclosure like nutrition panels, nitrogen source, phosphorus origin, additive list, known contaminants, and a declared runoff risk under typical use. That wouldn't be a sticker for farmers alone. It would be a QR code in the store aisle that links the apple in your hand to the nitrogen that fed it. Industry argues that standardized agronomy, not shopper-facing labels, is the right fix. They say agronomic recommendations already account for environmental risk, and too much disclosure would confuse buyers and expose trade secrets. What nobody adds in the press release, opacity preserves pricing power. If you don't know how your bag differs from the competitor, you haggle on brand and delivery, not on origin, contamination baselines, or carbon intensity. And speaking of carbon, the clean ammonia pitch thrives in this blind spot. Blue and green labels sell tax credits and comfort, but the capture rates, methane leaks, and shipping hazards live in technical annexes few read. Because fertilizer isn't food, there's no familiar consumer pressure to align claims with dinner reality. Emissions become an accounting game against baselines that never enter the grocery conversation. Meanwhile, farmers sit in the crossfire. Their contracts and credit lines assume fertilizer use, their water quality rules tighten, their customers ask for sustainable without paying more. When regulators do move, they aim at field practices, not upstream manufacturing. The bill lands on the person with the least pricing power in the chain. Here's the quiet consequence. The grocery store looks lawful while the system that feeds it dodges the laws we use for everything else we swallow. Call that illegal if you're talking about the spirit of food rules, not the letter. We decided on paper that the thing that most determines what ends up on your plate isn't part of food law, and the companies at the tap learn to operate in that shadow. Next, watch what happens when the same inputs can switch from bread to bombs without rewriting a single statute. The scariest fine print you never read. The war switch. To understand how inputs become policy, watch ammonia flip its badge. The same molecule that fattens wheat can shred steel when you teach it chemistry's rougher manners. In peacetime, ammonia is a promise. In wartime, it's a pipeline to explosives. No new permits, no new miracle, just valves, reactors, and schedules shifting from bread to bomb. World War I made that switch famous. Before the shooting started, empires bought Chilean nitrate for both fertilizer and munitions. Blockades cut that cord. Germany, boxed in at sea, leaned on the thing Haber and Bosch had conjured. Convert ammonia to nitric acid, marry it to glycerin or TNT precursors, and suddenly the countryside's yield map shares a blood type with artillery shells. Railway cars that used to carry sacks for fields began feeding powder line. The same foremen who bragged about bushels per acre learned to count detonations per hour. On the front lines, you could taste the chemistry. Shells arrived in volumes that defied the old nitrate calculus. Without Haber-Bosch, historians argue, Germany's supplies would have strangled sooner. With it, the war bled longer. Back home, farmers took delivery of less nitrogen and made do. In diaries, you read men arguing over whether to save seed or slaughter a hog early, while the plant over the hill worked night shifts under blackout curtains. The molecule didn't pick sides, it followed orders. WWII standardized the choreography. Governments mapped nitrogen like fuel. Ammonia plants sat on priority lists. Coal and natural gas fed them first. A plant manager might spend breakfast negotiating labor, lunch negotiating compressor parts, dinner negotiating rail slots for ammonium nitrate, now destined for both corn and cordite. In Iowa, a farmer spread AN on a spring field. In a coastal arsenal, workers pressed AN into mixtures that would leave a different kind of mark on the earth. You could trace a week's output. Monday's ammonia to Tuesday's nitric acid to Friday's bombs on a freighter headed west. Meanwhile, something else was happening across borders. States realized that nitrogen capacity was a form of sovereignty. If your country could synthesize ammonia at scale, you weren't hostage to faraway mines or enemy navies. After the war, that logic didn't fade, it bureaucratized. State-owned giants grew, Soviet combines, Middle Eastern joint ventures tethered to gas fields, national champions with footprints that sprawled like power grid. Cold War planning tables put fertilizer on the same page as steel and oil. Officially, agriculture, practically infrastructure, functionally strategic. That logic lives on in sanctions and trade. Fertilizer can be a pressure point without sounding like one. You don't need to embargo bread if you can tighten the upstream valves. A customs announcement here, a shipping insurance tweak there, and a region's planting math slides out of view. When Belarus faced sanctions, potash flows pinched. When Russia faced them, ammonia and urea roots rerouted, then snarled. None of this reads like a headline about food. It reads like energy, shipping, finance. Until a market in Lagos raises maize prices and a parent switches stew recipes. Case in point, an export cut ripples into street tempers. Picture a rice importer's phone lighting up after a fertilizer exporter announces temporary domestic priority. Farmers upstream scale back nitrogen rates. Harvests slip just enough. Wholesale prices flicker. In a city where bread subsidies buffer anger, the math loses its cushion. A rumor spreads, the government's hiding stock. By the time anyone prints a chart, shopkeepers are pulling down metal shutters. Fertilizer policy isn't a press conference. It's a week no one forgets. Micro story, in a coastal town, a dockworker stacks pallets of ammonium nitrate. He's done it for years. It smells sharp, it dusts his boots, it pays well. One summer, customs flags a container for dual-use review. The shift slows. Later that evening, he watches a clip on his phone of a faraway port exploding, a red-orange bloom swallowing cranes. The product on his forklift can grow tomatoes or level neighborhoods. He sleeps badly for a week and doesn't say why. Defense planners never forgot the civil risks. Big stockpiles can become instant disasters. Regulations tightened, then loosened under pressure, then tightened again after tragedy. The tug-of-war mirrors the larger one, convenience and cost against risk and responsibility. Manufacturers emphasize safe when used as directed. Firefighters read, bring water, bring prayers. Meanwhile, agriculture has to plant. The war switch doesn't wait for moral clarity. If a state decides explosives need priority, shipments bend. If peace returns, contracts for spring tonnage are suddenly sacred again. The switch flips without speeches because the system is built to be flippable. That was the selling point. It still is. This is the hidden grammar of inputs. They obey command more cleanly than rain, soil, or seed. That makes them powerful levers in crises, military or political. It also means your pantry is never purely civilian. Break one pipe by sanction, sabotage, strike, or storm, and you don't just slow a factory. You shift a continent's dinner. The 2020s shock. Gas, war, and empty bins. While that war switch sat in the background like a loaded fuse, the 2020s walked in and lit the other end, energy. Ammonia is married to natural gas. Gas provides the hydrogen, gas runs the heat, gas sets the price. When gas gets expensive, ammonia plants don't just grimace, they go quiet. And when they go quiet in winter, a spring months later starts with empty bins. 3 days before Christmas 2021, a plant manager in the Netherlands opened his inbox and saw the math he dreaded. Spot gas prices made every ton of ammonia a loss. He walked the floor, counted the compressors he'd have to idle, and wrote a short note. Curtailment begins at 1800. You don't hear that note at a grocery store. You feel it 7 months later when the early corn turns a lighter green because the farmer cut his side dress by a third. The quiet echo of a gas chart. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the map. Europe's rebound from pandemic lows slammed into a cold winter and tight gas supply. LNG cargoes chased higher bids, pipelines became leverage. The chart of Dutch TTF gas looked like a mountain, and right behind it, the chart of nitrogen fertilizers climbed in echo. Retailers in the Midwest told growers, "Book now if you can, we can't promise later." Some farmers prepaid at nosebleed prices hoping to secure tons. Others prayed for a break and planted beans instead of corn. Then Russia invaded Ukraine and the quiet dependencies turned loud. Russia isn't just a grain exporter, it's a heavyweight in nitrogen, and with Belarus, a pillar in potash. War scrambled maritime routes, insurance, port access, and the safety of Black Sea corridors that moved not just grain but ammonia. A single pipeline from Tolyatti to Odessa that had fed world markets for decades became a bargaining chip and sometimes a dead line on a map. A broker in Istanbul watched vessel trackers and said out loud what his spreadsheet already knew. This isn't about availability alone, it's about arrival. Sanctions didn't have to list fertilizer to hit it. Banks hesitated, shippers hesitated, insurers wrote clauses no one had seen in years. Even when product could legally move, practical movement slowed. In Brazil, soybean growers watched potash deliveries slip. In East Africa, urea bids got outbid by someone with more cash and closer ports. China, facing its own domestic concerns, tightened urea exports, turning Southeast Asia's anxiety into orders that wouldn't clear for weeks. India swung tenders like hammers to keep domestic prices from spiking. And vessels diverted mid-ocean because the math changed on a Tuesday. Microstory, a co-op agronomist in Illinois, sits at his desk in February 2022 with 3 monitors open, weather, gas futures, and a shipping dashboard. His phone doesn't stop. Can I get 32% by April? Should I swap to anhydrous? What's the worst case? He gives the same careful answer to everyone. Let's talk about rates and timing. We'll stretch what we have. That spring, his members run narrower bars on applicators, skip a pass, or split applications with more precision than they ever bothered with before. It works, sort of. The corn is fine where rains come right. It's hungry where they don't. Here's the geometry nobody loves to think about. Energy shocks become food shocks because ammonia rides gas. Every additional dollar per MMBTU shows up months later in wheat bids. And when farmers cut back, the harvest shrinks at the edges. A few bushels here, a few there, multiplied by continents. In 2022, global fertilizer benchmarks tripled from their sleepy baselines, then eased, then jolted again when some other piece of the chain hiccuped. Supermarket managers don't read Argus price reports, but they noticed the parsley wholesale price doing things parsley never did. Export bans turned the screws further. Governments, worried about domestic stability, did the rational thing for themselves, kept more at home. That meant less for someone else. In South Asia, distributors rationed bags. In West Africa, some fields didn't see a single granule and still got planted because families can't eat a perfect plan. A woman in Senegal looked at her peanut field and said, "We'll do what we can. We've done thin years before." Thin years scale. Meanwhile, gas-curtailed Europe leaned on imports. The Middle East, tied to cheap gas, shipped what it could. North America ran hard where margins made sense, but ammonia plants aren't light switches. Starting and stopping costs money and risk. A unit idled for months needs careful nursing to restart, and every delay begs the same painful question. Do we eat the loss or pass it forward? The answer, almost always, is both. On the ground, farmers adjusted in ways that felt small and mattered a lot. More soil tests to target rates, more spring applications to chase yield when weather cooperated, more cover crops where they'd penciled out before but now made cash sense by scavenging leftover nitrogen. A few tried biofertilizers and called the reps too often. Many rediscovered manure, then ran into the same old logistics wall. Moving wet nutrients is heavy, smelly, and political. Still, the habit cracked just enough for experiments to slip in. All the while, grocers heard a script they'd heard for years, supply chain issues, and shoppers rolled their eyes. But this time, the chain began at a compressor house and a gas hub, not a shipping container from Shenzhen. The 2020s taught us the quiet part out loud. If you can break one pipe, you can bend a menu. And if ammonia is the hinge, then natural gas is the hand on the door. The soil that forgot how to breathe. Walk into a field that's seen decades of easy nitrogen and listen, not with ears, with boots. The ground feels tight. The shovel bites shallow, then hits a pan your grandfather didn't talk about. The roots above it look like a hand pressed against glass. The air down there is thin because we trained the system to run on a drip of soluble N, not on the slow exhale of living soil. Microbes notice first. Give a plant constant nitrate and it stops hiring help. The sugars it would have traded to fungi and bacteria get rerouted because the plant thinks, why barter when the buffet's open? Mycorrhizae back off. Nitrogen-fixing free agents fade because legumes left the rotation. The underground economy shrinks. Then the human economy comes in with a heavier tractor and a single cash crop and presses the breath out a little more each year. You see it after a storm. Water sheens on the surface because pore spaces collapsed. It runs to the ditch, and with it goes the nitrogen we bought, the phosphorus we mined, and the silt the river never asked for. Downstream, a reservoir manager glances at chlorophyll readings and schedules a public notice. Upstream, a farmer blames the 10-year rain that now arrives every other season. Both are right and both are stuck. Here's the quiet pathology. Salts creep in when soluble fertilizers and irrigation pile on. The EC meter in a consultant's truck blinks higher year over year. Germination stutters at the edge of the patch. Leaves tip burn. The fix offered is a flush, gypsum, more careful timing, maybe a different product, administered like a prescription in a clinic that doesn't ask why the patient keeps landing in triage. Compaction doesn't just come from weight, it comes from sameness. Corn on corn on corn starves the dirt of diverse roots. Roots are architecture. They pry, they leak sugars, they feed the crew that builds the condos, aggregates, the crumb structure that holds air and water like a sponge. Strip away cover crops, kill the hay meadow, skip the pasture phase, and you flatten a city to a parking lot. Parking lots don't breathe, they shed. Meanwhile, microbes handle the nitrogen hangover like bouncers after a festival. Give them a flood of nitrate, and denitrifiers wake up in the oxygen-poor pockets. They do what they do, turn nitrate into nitrous oxide and dinitrogen. Some of that is harmless N2 back to the sky. Some is N2O, a greenhouse gas that hits the climate harder than CO2. It's the soil's way of saying, too much, too fast, and billing the atmosphere for our pacing mistake. Health lands in the tap. In rural clinics, nurses still use an old phrase for infant methemoglobinemia, blue baby. It's rare, it spikes after heavy rains, and it traces to nitrate in groundwater. Utility managers buy new membranes and shrug at the rate hike they can't blame on one field or one storm. Farmers read the article and feel accused for a system they didn't design. That's the feedback loop nobody wants to own. Now get this, when leaves yellow late season from shallow roots and a tired soil profile, the go-to advice in a lot of playbooks is a rescue shot of nitrogen. It works visually. The plant greens. Photosynthesis hums for a few more weeks, yields even bump in a forgiving year. The problem underneath doesn't change. You bought time, not breath. Next season, the craving returns a week earlier. Microstory: Maria, third generation on a 400-acre patch, runs a spade along a fence line that still holds prairie sod. The soil there crumbles, smells sweet after rain, and swallows the shovel. 15 feet away in the corn headland, the blade skids. She stands there, one boot in each world, and says to nobody, "We traded lungs for IV drips." There's another tell: earthworms. In healthy ground, you cut a slice and count them like old folks count lightning seconds. In the hurried fields, you lift a slab and see one, maybe two, thin, pale. You can farm by worm census. Fewer worms mean fewer biopores, fewer drains for sudden storms, fewer channels for roots to find last week's moisture. Fewer worms means more dependency on pumps, passes, and luck. So what now? Some folks reintroduce breath with cover crops: rye that needles through tight layers, radish that drills and rots into air shafts, clovers that drip-feed nitrogen in forms a plant negotiates for, not grabs. Rotations widen. Livestock return on careful terms, bringing manure that doesn't just carry NPK but microbes and carbon that stitches crumbs back together. Precision tools help: split applications, sensors that read greenness instead of guessing, maps that respect the sand knob and the clay swale as separate nation. None of that snaps fingers. A compacted inch took years to earn. It takes seasons to forgive. The first spring after a cover, the field might look messy, the neighbors might smirk, and the coffee shop might pass a joke, but the second storm stands a little longer on the surface before slipping in. The late June corn holds color without a panic pass. The well report quietly trends better. You feel air where there wasn't any. The trap was never nitrogen itself. It was teaching soil to forget its job. We made it a medium for inputs, not a partner. When it forgets how to breathe, the bills stack. More passes, more pounds, more prayers. When it relearns, the system stops gasping. And that's the pivot the monopoly hates, not because farmers use zero fertilizer, but because living soil lowers the volume on the clean ammonia and blue promises. While farmers wrestled with tired ground and twitchy prices, a new story rolled onto conference stages with glossy slides. Clean ammonia. The pitch was tidy. Keep the molecule, change the color. Blue if you bolt carbon capture to fossil hydrogen. Green if you split water with renewable electricity. Same fertilizer, new conscience. Investors nodded. Politicians heard jobs. The tap owners heard subsidies and tax credits big enough to move boardroom. Here's how the colors work, minus the brochure polish. Blue ammonia starts with natural gas, just like the gray stuff. You reform methane into hydrogen, then funnel the carbon dioxide into a capture unit and promise to bury or reuse it. On paper, it slashes emissions per ton. In practice, capture rates live in the messy middle, 60, 70, 80% if everything hums. Then there's methane itself. Tiny leaks along wells and pipelines add up, and methane warms the planet harder and faster than carbon dioxide. If your capture rig sings but your upstream gas slips, the math can wobble from cleaner to nice try. Green ammonia skips gas and chases purity. Electrolyzers turn water into hydrogen using wind or solar power, then the old Haber-Bosch loop bolts that hydrogen to nitrogen. No fossil carbon anywhere near the stack. The catch? Electricity, lots of it at the right price around the clock, feeding a process that prefers steady heartbeat over fits and starts. You can buffer with hydrogen storage or new reactor designs, but every fix costs steel and time. The spreadsheet doesn't lie. Green looks beautiful when power is cheap, steady, and near a port. It wilts when the grid sputters or the price spikes at dinner time. Meanwhile, something else was happening in back rooms. Tax credits bloomed like spring weeds. Carbon capture got a per-ton bonus. Clean hydrogen earned extra dollars per kilogram if you ticked the right boxes. Suddenly, press releases bragged about final investment decisions for blue units next to existing plants and green pilots tied to showcase wind farms. A quiet truth sat between the lines. The revenue from credits sometimes outshone the revenue from fertilizer. You could harvest policy while you harvested wheat. Microstory: a plant accountant in Texas opens a new tab in his model and adds the hydrogen production credit. The project that didn't pencil last winter now gleams. He circles a number and emails the CEO. With 45V and 45Q stacked, payback hits 6 years. Out in the county, farmers still haggle over urea bids. Neither side knows they're now co-authors of a climate finance novel.